In the quiet stretches of rural Texas, where cattle fields roll uninterrupted for miles and the past feels safely buried, something deeply unsettling began to surface. Unmarked graves. No names. No dates. Just human remains turning up again and again, always in small clusters, always without records, and always pointing to the same brutal truth. These were not pioneer burials or forgotten family plots. They were slave graves hidden deliberately, erased from history on purpose. What disturbed historians even more was the pattern. Soil analysis, bone positioning, and regional records all suggested these people died on the same night. Not over years, not across generations. One night, a single coordinated moment of violence so complete that it left no official trace, no court documents, no plantation logs, no church records. Just bodies returned to the earth as if they had never existed. As excavations continued, the questions grew heavier. Who were they? What happened that night? And why was Texas decades after emancipation still uncovering evidence of a massacre no one ever wrote down? This is not just a story about graves. It is about silence, complicity, and a chapter of American history that tried very hard to stay buried. The discovery began quietly, almost accidentally, the way many buried truths do. A land survey for a new road, a routine construction project, a farmer digging deeper than usual after a drought. Bones surfaced where no cemetery had ever been marked, no headstones stood, no family plots were recorded. At first, local authorities assumed they were pioneer remains or victims of disease outbreaks common in early Texas history, but the absence of coffins, personal items, and any form of burial ritual immediately raised doubts. These bodies had been placed into the ground hastily, layered close together without care or ceremony, as if speed and secrecy mattered more than dignity. As more sites were uncovered across different counties, the similarities became impossible to ignore. The graves were shallow, often dug just deep enough to hide the bodies from animals and passing eyes. There were no wooden markers, no stones, no religious symbols. The skeletal remains showed signs of hard labor, worn joints, compressed spines, damaged teeth from malnutrition and stress. These were not settlers with families who would have marked their resting places. These were enslaved people, reduced in death to the same invisibility they endured in life. Historians began comparing the locations of the graves with old plantation maps, tax records, and property deeds. Again and again, the sites aligned with former slaveholding lands, places where large numbers of enslaved people had lived and worked, yet where no burial records existed. Churches that meticulously logged white congregants' deaths showed nothing for the enslaved population living just beyond their doors. County ledgers listed livestock losses in detail, but failed to record human deaths that should have been impossible to miss. The silence in the paperwork was not accidental. It was systemic. What made the discoveries even more disturbing was their repetition. This was not a single forgotten graveyard or an isolated incident. Similar burial sites appeared miles apart, sometimes discovered years later, sometimes only weeks after the previous one. Each time, the pattern remained the same. Multiple bodies, no identifiers, no dates, no acknowledgement in any surviving document. It suggested a shared practice. A normalized way of disposing of enslaved bodies when acknowledging their deaths was inconvenient, dangerous, or incriminating. Archaeologists noted that many of the bodies had been buried without clothing fasteners, jewelry, or tools, items often found even in poor free burials of the same era. This absence hinted at something darker than neglect. Clothing may have been removed to prevent identification. Personal items may have been stripped away to erase any trace of individuality. In some graves, bodies were positioned unnaturally close, overlapping in ways that suggested haste rather than reverence. These were not burials meant to honor the dead. They were meant to hide them. The lack of dates proved just as telling as the lack of names. In an era obsessed with record-keeping for property and profit, the omission of death dates pointed to intentional erasure. Plantation owners recorded crop yields, slave purchases, punishments, and even medical expenses for enslaved workers, yet these deaths appeared nowhere. The implication was chilling. Whatever happened to these people was something no one wanted written down. The graves were not simply unmarked. They were meant to disappear entirely. Local oral histories added another layer of unease. In some communities, elders spoke in hushed tones about areas children were told not to play in, fields where the ground was said to be bad, patches of land where animals refused to graze. Stories passed down hinted at violence, at nights when screams carried across plantations and were never spoken of again. These accounts were never formalized into written history, but when matched with the archaeological findings, they began to sound less like folklore and more like suppressed memory. The discoveries forced historians to confront an uncomfortable reality about slavery in Texas. Death among the enslaved was common, but it was not usually hidden. Enslaved people were valuable property, and their deaths were often noted for financial reasons alone. The complete absence of records suggested these individuals died under circumstances that threatened the power structures of the time. Illness, age, and exhaustion did not need to be hidden. Violence on a scale large enough to leave multiple bodies in unmarked graves did. Each new site raised questions not only about what happened, but about who knew. Slave owners, overseers, local officials, clergy, and neighbors would have been aware of sudden disappearances, yet no letters, diaries, or court proceedings mentioned them. This collective silence pointed to complicity, a shared understanding that some events were better left undocumented. The land itself became the only witness, holding the evidence until modern tools and curiosity forced it back into the light. The emotional weight of these graves grew heavier as forensic studies reconstructed fragments of individual lives. Age ranges suggested men and women in their physical prime, people who would have been crucial to plantation labor. Some skeletons showed healed injuries from previous abuse, indicating long histories of violence before their final moments. Others bore perimortem trauma that aligned with blunt force or restraint, injuries that occurred at or near the time of death. These details contradicted any notion of natural or accidental causes. Community reactions were often conflicted. Some residents expressed shock and sorrow, while others resisted further investigation, arguing that reopening the past served no purpose. But the repeated discoveries made it clear that this was not about isolated tragedies. It was about a system that treated human beings as disposable and then worked deliberately to erase even the evidence of their disposal. The absence of names and dates was not an oversight. It was the final act of dehumanization. As researchers mapped the graves, patterns emerged that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Similar burial techniques across different properties implied shared methods, possibly even shared events. The idea that enslaved people could vanish en masse without a single official record challenged long-held narratives about how slavery operated in Texas. It revealed a darker underside where extreme violence could occur beyond the reach of accountability, protected by law, racism, and silence. Each unmarked grave forced a reckoning with the idea that history is not just what is written but what is deliberately left out. The soil held answers that ledgers refused to provide, and bones told stories that ink never would. These graves were not anomalies. They were evidence of a hidden pattern, a shadow history running beneath the official one, waiting for the moment when someone would finally ask why so many people could disappear without a trace and be left beneath Texas earth as if their lives had never mattered at all. What transformed suspicion into something far more chilling was the science. When forensic teams began examining the remains, they expected variation, different stages of decay, different burial depths, signs of deaths spread over months or years. Instead, they found consistency. Soil compression patterns showed the graves had been filled at roughly the same time. The layers of earth above the bodies had settled uniformly, indicating simultaneous disturbance rather than repeated burials. In multiple locations, insect activity and mineral staining aligned so closely that experts concluded the bodies had been placed in the ground within hours of one another. Radiocarbon dating narrowed the window further. While it could not pinpoint an exact date, it placed the deaths within the same brief period. There was no evidence of seasonal difference, no indication that some died in summer heat while others perished in winter cold. The remains spoke of one moment, not a prolonged span. Even the surrounding artifacts, or lack of them, reinforced this conclusion. There were no later intrusions into the graves, no signs that they had been reopened or reused. Everything about the site suggested urgency, secrecy, and a single coordinated act. The positions of the bodies deepened the unease. Many were laid out in similar orientations, aligned as if by instruction rather than chance. Arms were sometimes bound close to the body, legs positioned unnaturally straight or crossed, suggesting restraint before burial. In some cases, individuals were placed side by side with barely inches between them, a method that conserves time rather than space. This was not the work of grieving family members or even a hurried epidemic burial overseen by authorities. It bore the hallmarks of people following orders. Injuries told the same story. Forensic anthropologists identified trauma patterns that were consistent across multiple skeletons. Blunt force injuries to the skull, fractures to ribs and forearms, damage to wrists and ankles that indicated binding. The timing of these injuries mattered most. They occurred at or immediately before death, not years earlier. Different bodies carried different wounds, but the nature of the violence repeated itself with disturbing regularity. This was not random cruelty inflicted over time. It was organized, synchronized, and decisive. What made this conclusion even more unsettling was the geography. These graves were not all located on a single plantation. They were scattered across regions, sometimes miles apart, yet shared the same forensic timeline. For such coordination to occur, communication would have been required. Someone gave instructions. Someone decided when it would happen. Someone ensured that multiple groups of enslaved people were eliminated and buried before daylight brought witnesses and questions. The scale implied planning, not panic. Historians began revisiting periods of heightened tension in Texas slave history, times of rumored uprisings, whispers of rebellion, or moments when enslaved communities were suspected of organizing resistance. Slave patrol records, where they existed, spoke vaguely of disturbances or preventative measures, but never detailed outcomes. The language was intentionally opaque, designed to suggest order restored without revealing the cost. When matched with the dating of the graves, these vague references took on a far more sinister meaning. The idea of a single night of violence contradicted popular narratives that portrayed slavery as a slow, grinding cruelty rather than sudden mass brutality, yet the evidence forced a reckoning with the possibility that extreme measures were sometimes taken swiftly and silently. A massacre carried out under the cover of darkness would explain why no escape attempts were recorded, why no legal proceedings followed, why no owners reported losses. A single night left no time for resistance, no survivors to testify, no daylight to raise alarm. Environmental clues supported this theory. In several burial sites, researchers found signs that the graves had been dug hastily, likely after sunset. Tool marks suggested inexperienced or rushed digging, with uneven edges and inconsistent depths. The soil contained traces of trampled vegetation that had not had time to regrow before being buried, indicating heavy foot traffic concentrated in a short span. In some areas, nearby trees showed broken branches or bark damage consistent with groups moving quickly through the dark. Oral traditions, once dismissed as superstition, suddenly aligned with the science. Stories of a long night, of fires burning until dawn, of enslaved quarters falling eerily silent the next morning. Elders recalled ancestors speaking of a sudden absence, of dozens of people gone at once, their names never spoken again. These accounts lacked dates and specifics, but their consistency across communities mirrored the physical evidence emerging from the ground. The coordination suggested fear at the highest levels of the slave system. Fear that control was slipping. Fear that resistance might spread. Fear that resistance might spread. Fear that mercy would be interpreted as weakness. A single night of overwhelming violence would have served as both punishment and warning, a message delivered not through words, but through disappearance. Those left alive would understand without needing explanation. Silence would be enforced not just by threat, but by memory. The absence of any attempt to disguise the cause of death also mattered. There was no effort to stage the graves as disease victims or accident casualties. Instead, the strategy was erasure. No records, no markers, no acknowledgement that these people had ever died at all. If history relied on paperwork, then eliminating paperwork was enough to make the event vanish. The land would remember, but land does not testify in court. As more data accumulated, scholars began using the phrase single event burial, a term reserved for disasters and mass executions. To apply it to slavery-era Texas was radical, even uncomfortable. It challenged the idea that such events were rare or confined to wartime. It suggested that under certain conditions, enslaved people could be killed en masse and buried before anyone outside the system noticed or cared. The coordinated nature of the graves demanded a reevaluation of how violence functioned as a tool of control. The realization that all these lives likely ended within the same hours stripped away any lingering ambiguity. This was not neglect, it was not coincidence. It was not the slow attrition of an inhumane system alone. It was a deliberate act carried out in a narrow window of time calculated to avoid witnesses, records, and repercussions. One night was all it took to erase dozens of people from written history, leaving only fractured bones and disturbed soil to speak for them centuries later, still locked in the moment when darkness fell, and an entire group was made to disappear at once. What lingered after the physical evidence was mapped and dated was a more unsettling absence, one that could not be excavated with shovels or scanners. The archives were empty. County courthouses that held meticulous records of land transfers, debts, livestock inventories, and tax disputes showed nothing about the sudden disappearance of enslaved people whose labor had been essential to local economies. Plantation journals that detailed daily weather, crop conditions, and punishments recorded nothing unusual during the period when dozens of people appear to have died. Church burial logs listed white parishioners by name and date, but left entire pages blank where enslaved deaths should have appeared. The erasure was not subtle, it was total. Historians searching for explanations quickly realized that this silence could not be accidental. Enslaved people were property under the law, and their deaths usually represented financial loss. Owners documented such losses precisely because they affected balance sheets. The fact that no such losses were recorded suggested that acknowledging these deaths carried greater risk than ignoring them. Writing anything down would have created a paper trail, and paper trails invite questions. Silence, by contrast, ensured safety for those responsible. The legal system reinforced this silence. Courts rarely accepted testimony from enslaved people, and violence against them was seldom prosecuted unless it threatened white property or order. If an entire group of enslaved individuals was killed, the law offered no meaningful mechanism to challenge it. Judges, sheriffs, and patrol leaders were often slaveholders themselves or depended on them socially and economically. Any official investigation would have implicated neighbors, business partners, and family members. Doing nothing preserved stability, at least on paper. Language played a crucial role in this erasure. When documents did mention disturbances, they used vague phrases that concealed reality rather than revealed it. Words like corrected, removed, relocated, or settled appeared in letters and patrol notes without explanation. These euphemisms allowed violent acts to be acknowledged indirectly while avoiding explicit description. Over time, even these coded references faded, leaving behind only the polished narrative of orderly plantations and benevolent control. Education systems later cemented the omission. Early Texas histories celebrated expansion, independence, and agricultural success, while reducing slavery to a background detail. Textbooks described enslaved labor as essential but avoided the mechanics of control that made it possible. Mass violence did not fit the heroic story of frontier resilience, so it was excluded. Generations grew up without language to describe what the graves would later reveal, making recognition even harder when physical evidence finally emerged. Families who may have known the truth often chose silence as well. Descendants of slaveholders inherited land, wealth, and reputation. Admitting that an ancestor participated in or benefited from mass murder threatened all three. Silence became a form of inheritance, passed down as firmly as property lines. Stories were altered, softened, or simply never told. Over time, forgetting became easier than remembering. For the descendants of the enslaved, the silence took a different form. Oral histories survived, but they were fragmented, stripped of names and dates by fear and time. Speaking openly about past violence could invite retaliation even decades later. Some families moved away, carrying only warnings and half-remembered tales. Others stayed, learning which topics were unsafe to raise. Without official acknowledgement, grief had nowhere to go. Memory survived quietly, hidden in phrases and rituals whose origins were no longer fully understood. The absence of documentation also shaped modern reactions to the discoveries. Without written proof, some critics questioned the interpretations, demanding records that had been deliberately destroyed or never created. The burden of evidence fell entirely on bones and soil, as if physical remains alone had to justify their own existence. This skepticism echoed the original logic of erasure. What is not written down can be dismissed. Yet the consistency of the silence across institutions revealed its purpose. It was not one missing document or one negligent clerk. It was an entire system aligned to protect itself. Churches avoided moral responsibility. Courts avoided legal responsibility. Landowners avoided financial and social consequences. Even newspapers, which eagerly reported crimes among white communities, remained mute. The absence itself became evidence of coordination. As scholars pieced together what little remained, they found traces of intentional destruction, gaps in ledger sequences, torn pages, journals that abruptly ended or skipped months, fires that conveniently consumed records while leaving nearby structures untouched. Each missing piece narrowed the possibilities rather than expanded them. Accidental loss does not repeat with such precision. The long-term impact of this erasure extended beyond history books. It shaped how communities understood themselves. Towns built identities around harmony and tradition, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge foundations laid on unspoken violence. Monuments commemorated battles and founders but marked no graves for the enslaved. Public memory favored celebration over reckoning, reinforcing the idea that some lives were never part of the story to begin with. When the graves finally surfaced, they challenged not only historical narratives but moral ones. If such an event could be erased so completely, what else had been removed from collective memory? How many other nights went unrecorded? How many other sites still lay undisturbed beneath fields and roads? The discovery suggested that the written history of slavery was not merely incomplete, but selectively curated. The struggle to name the victims highlighted the final cruelty of the erasure. Without records, names were lost, families severed permanently from their ancestors. Memorial efforts faced the impossible task of honoring individuals who could not be identified. The anonymity imposed in death persisted centuries later, a continuation of the same logic that denied personhood in life. What remained undeniable was that forgetting had been an active process, not a passive one. It required decisions, cooperation, and time. It required generations to agree, implicitly or explicitly, that some truths were better left unspoken. The graves disrupted that agreement. They forced a confrontation between what was remembered and what was buried, exposing how history can be shaped as much by what it refuses to record as by what it chooses to preserve. The ground did what the records refused to do. It kept the truth intact long after ink faded and silence became tradition. These graves are not just evidence of death. They are proof of intent, proof that violence was organized, erased, and protected by an entire system that depended on forgetting. What happened that night was meant to vanish forever. But history does not stay buried. Every bone uncovered, every unmarked pit exposed, pulls the past into the present, and asks a question that can no longer be avoided. How many lives were erased simply because remembering them threatened the story America chose to tell?